welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, but we know this is simply not true. This is a Canadian podcast about the myths, legends, and just good old stories Canada has to tell. I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for joining me today as we go searching for the legendary Al Capone and his Canadian connections. And I guess you would call this one a sort of true crime scavenger hunt? As we go province hopping and discover some stories, places, and possibly even a ghost that the notorious gangster Al Capone left behind here in Canada. Trigger warning here. We are dealing with tales of Al Capone in this adventure. We will discuss topics such as ladies of the night, gambling, guns, murder, and If these topics are triggering to you, please skip this adventure today and choose another one. That being said, you know me, I will only say what needs to be said. Now I could go through all the history of Al Capone and how he came to be known as one of the most notorious gangsters of our time. But there's a lot of amazing podcasts out there that have already done that for you. For today, we are just looking at Al Capone's connections to Canada, because there are a lot more than you may think. Our story takes us first to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, a small railway junction town of about 33,000 people today. But back in the 1920s, when our story begins, there was only about 20,000. Everyone knew their neighbors, and everyone knew when an outsider was in town, especially someone who drove such a big, flashy black car through the streets, only to park near a very popular establishment at the time known as Miss Fanny's Club, and then disappear into the underground pretty much unnoticed to all. At this time, this village had earned a couple nicknames: Little Chicago, or less commonly, the Red Light of the Prairies. No thanks to its most famous visitor, Al Capone. Having both a Canadian Pacific Railway station and a Canadian National Railway station, Moose Jaw was a bootlegger's dream. It certainly made shipping and receiving very easy, and Al Capone could hop on the Soo Line train in Chicago and head up to do business in Canada pretty much unnoticed, which is what most believe he did. It was during the Prohibition time when Al Capone arrived in Saskatchewan, and he soon discovered there were underground tunnels all over the inner city, and he made use of them right away, stashing his alcohol, guns, and more. One of the tunnels even went right to the Canadian Pacific Railway station. Like mentioned before, this was all about easy shipping and receiving, and Moose Jaw was the perfect location. They were able to load and unload rail cars full of alcohol without being seen. He also had ladies of the night working underground, and many gambling tables were often going each night. To enter, you had to know where the secret doors were, and you had to know the secret knock to get in. Everyone knew back then that the underground was Al Capone's. Even the local police chief at the time, Walter Johnson, was said to be working with the famed gangster. One local claims to have run errands for the underground gangsters, who would pay him 10 cents an errand. Today, that's about $1.50. I'm not sure what the errands were, but if they were just a young child at the time, I can't imagine they were grabbing anything more than a coffee or a newspaper. So that's not a bad deal at all. Another local claims her father, Bill Beamish, was Al's barber and would be picked up by other men in fancy dark suits and cars and taken down to the tunnels to give Al Capone a haircut. A Dr. Young also claims to have removed Al's tonsils after a terrible infection. Being that Moose Jaw was known as Little Chicago at the time and was so easily accessible from Chicago by train, there are tales that many of the Chicago gangsters were known to be in the area from time to time, hiding out or just catching some R&R. Like Diamond Jim Brady, who was Capone's right-hand man, many locals claim to have seen him around town. The famous gangster had a diamond embedded in his front tooth and was hard to mistake for someone else. As recently as the 1970s, the existence of the Moose Jaw tunnels were just considered to be rumors and were often quickly dismissed by local officials, until part of Main Street collapsed, revealing the truth once and for all. Today, the town's most popular attractions, located at 18 Main Street, is visited by tourists from around the world, and you can take a tour of these tunnels and follow along, as amazing actors recreate what was once an underground gangster's lair. To see pictures and videos of the tunnels, the links are always in the show notes below. Since 1867, the Albany Hotel has stood in Guelph, Ontario, located on Norfolk Street today. Back then, when our story takes place, in the 1920s, the road was affectionately known by the locals as Whiskey Street. A room at the Albany Hotel would cost you about $1.50 back then, which included a place to keep your horse for the night, alcohol, and cigars. Today, this would be about $33. That's not a bad deal at all. The hotel was also the second establishment in all of Ontario to receive a liquor license at the time, allowing the hotel to make their very own local house brew, something our friend Al Capone was very interested in at the time. Many speculate Capone had a connection to a very popular beer company today in Ontario, which was started in Guelph, that was restarted again in 1988, after it went bankrupt shortly after Al Capone died when it was caught shipping beer illegally to Chicago. So what's Al's connection to the hotel, besides stopping by to grab some Sleeman's beer, as it's speculated, and the local house brew to take down to Chicago? There's a couple things that link him to this location. The first is an upset and forgotten lover of Al Capone's that is said to have herself on the top floor of the hotel after being left behind for the last time by her lover. Today, she is seen as a lady dressed in all white. You hear her high heels coming, but see nothing there. The air gets extremely cold whenever she is near, and even creepier, she likes to nudge you on the shoulder if you weren't freaked out enough already. Interestingly, the second was that there are tunnels found under the hotel that lead towards the Church of Our Lady, or Catholic Hill as it is known by the locals. And we all know how much Al Capone liked to use tunnels to conduct his business. Legend says the notorious bootlegger would load up his trucks right behind the church. Today, these tunnels are boarded up or collapsed. No one, as far as I could find, has had access to them in years. Another stop on the Al Capone in Canada map is in Kemptville, Ontario, just 56 kilometers or 35 miles south of Ottawa, and just south of the Rideau River. Today, it has a population of 39,000 people, so around 1929, when Al Capone was said to be in the area, I can't imagine the population was very big. So it would seem pretty obvious if someone of Al Capone's means was suddenly in town, and that's exactly what people remember. Shiny black cars pulling up at the Rideau Glen golf course as it was being built. The golf club's own website claims an unnamed man, I am assuming a member of the golf club, that has lived in the town his whole life claims Al Capone would spend his summers at a residence on Oxford Street. To check out a picture of the house today, it's in the links below. Rumor says Al Capone gave money to the original owners of the golf course as he was a left-handed golfer and wanted a course that was set up just for that. The unnamed man even claims his father told him he had seen Al Capone himself pull up in a big black Cadillac while the golf course was under construction. The golf course was completed in 1929. And the house on Oxford Street, where the legendary gangster supposedly stayed in fact has tunnels underneath it that were found by one of the property's later owners. Another set of tunnels linked to a suspected Al Capone hideout. What do you think? Al Capone was also known to frequent the local Rideau River. A man who once drove the river taxi remembers picking up gangster-type men from time to time. Last stop on our adventure today is the most interesting one in my opinion. It appears Al Capone may have just set up shop 150 kilometers or 93 miles southwest of Ottawa in a small hamlet known as Quadville, Ontario. An old mining and lumber town, it's literally in the middle of nowhere, Ontario, the perfect hiding spot. And that's exactly what it's said to be. The famous gangster had a very strong log cabin built in the middle of the woods, so he could hide out during his last few years of life in some peace and quiet, it's said. Around the early 1940s, the small town would notice some new guests frequenting the area. They had flashy cars, wore expensive suits, had shiny shoes, and were said to be holidaying in the area. Located near the Opeongo line, one of the first roads built in Ontario, you can find the legendary cabin that sits on the highest point of land around. Just 2 to 3 kilometers out of town, the cabin was completed in 1942 by a local man, August Caulfield, who was paid a very large sum of cash by a mysterious man claiming to be from America. His great-niece, Kathleen, owns the local gas and general store today and still remembers the stories about her great-uncle building the famous gangster's cabin on the hill. The instructions for building the cabin were, it was to be fancy, but fortified at the same time, and was to be hidden in the middle of the woods away from everyone. It was only to have a few small windows, so you could not see in, many doors allowing for an easy escape from each room, and it was made out of very solid, thick logs, known as rough-hewn logs. The mystery man her great-uncle was paid by is believed now to be Joe Hatch, who is known to be one of Capone's men. It's believed Al Capone stayed at the cabin on and off between 1943 and 1947, just shortly after he was released from jail. The cabin is perfectly located as it looks over the 2 main roads coming into town. No one could sneak up unknowingly. When Al Capone was asked by a Star reporter about another bootlegging pal known to be from Canada, Al is famously quoted as saying, "I don't even know what street Canada is on." Found just up a narrow driveway that you would drive by if you didn't know it was there. Today, the hidden cabin in the woods is all boarded up, but of course, there is still a way in, thanks to vandals everywhere. There have been quite a few parties here, but it was also used for many years by snowmobilers passing through, needing to stop by and warm up for a bit. If you do find your way inside, do be careful. The floor is very weak in structure now, and there is a huge hole in the kitchen floor that is missing its door. That's right, a door in the kitchen floor, which can only mean one thing. There's a tunnel underneath the cabin, just like everywhere else Al Capone is known to hang out. It's said the tunnels were built to allow Capone to escape without being noticed if the cabin was ever under attack or investigation. No business is believed to have taken place in these tunnels. If you do head down to the tunnels, you won't get far as they are said to be all collapsed now, so please be careful. The tunnel from the kitchen is said to have led out to the middle of the woods. There is also a famous Al Capone tree on the grounds that is very strange looking, covered in huge burls, which are strange round-shaped growths off the tree. They are caused usually by stress, injuries, fungus, insects, or molds. Some suspect there is treasure buried under the tree, leading to its weird appearance. There is also rumors of a hatch-type door close by that leads to yet another tunnel. You can see pictures of Al's famous tree and the cabin, as well as videos in the links below. People remember an ill man coming through town for a short period of time, who seemed very wealthy, but kept to himself. Some also remember an ill man with a scar on his face. Al Capone was in fact very ill. He had been diagnosed with untreated syphilis that he had had for many years. The disease had done a number on his body, and he was running out of time. He also had a scar on his face that he was embarrassed by. In Chicago, the nickname Scarface was tossed around to describe the gangster, a nickname he very much did not like. The town folk also remember a man that was referred to as Uncle Al, a nickname he was much more affectionate to. Once Al Capone left the area, and the Hatch family as well, who was rumored to be staying in town, all the strange things stopped happening. Crime in the area almost immediately stopped. No one disappeared again. There were rumors of a few local men disappearing at different times, something that had never happened in the area before. One lady actually claims her brother left with the gangsters to go work with them. Maybe this is where some of the other missing men went. Today, Caulfield's Grocer, the local gas and general store, where Kathleen works, August Caulfield's great niece. They are the know-all and almost like a tiny museum for the cabin and the local legend. They have an entire wall dedicated to the story in their general store, with newspaper clippings and pictures plastered all over it. A sign proudly hangs claiming Quadville, Ontario, Canada, home of Al Capone's hidden cabin, built in 1942. They even have t-shirts to buy to mark the occasion if you make the road trip out to middle of nowhere in eastern Ontario. And if you ask nicely at the Caulfield Grocer, they, unlike Al Capone, will tell you exactly which street the cabin is hidden on. And if that doesn't work, there's also a geocache linked to the area. It appears notorious gangster Al Capone may have just known more about the streets in Canada than he thought when he made his famous remark. We found him today on our adventure on Main Street in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, on the affectionately named Whiskey Street by the locals at the Albany Hotel in Guelph, Ontario. He was also on Oxford Street in Kemptville, Ontario, and lived out some of his final days just off Letterkenny Road in the middle of nowhere near Quadville, Ontario. I'm Canadian Girl. Until next time, my friends.